Hello and welcome to episode 16 of Friending the Mirror. I'm your host, Dawn Shaw. I'm an author and a professional speaker, and I do this show so I can address issues about physical appearance and about things that affect physical appearance. And so what I do is I have a guest on for each episode, and that guest talks to me about their particular situation. Today's episode is titled, it has a title. I swear it has a title. It is Living with Albinism, Beyond the Pale. And I'm pleased to welcome my guest, Mike McGowan. Mike has albinism, and like so many with this condition, he is legally blind. This did not stop him, however, from earning a master's degree and spending 30 years employed by local government as an information technology professional in court management. He became involved with the National Organization of Albinism and Hypopigmentation in 1993. NOAA's mission is to act as a conduit for accurate and authoritative information about all aspects of living with albinism, and to provide a place where people with albinism and their families can find acceptance, support, and fellowship. After considerable time as a board member, Mike was hired as NOAA's first executive director in 2010. Mike, I am so happy to have you on with me because albinism is something I don't know much about. So I'm excited for the opportunity to learn more about albinism and how it affects the people who have it. Welcome, Mike.
Thank you so much, Don. I appreciate the opportunity to help educate people about albinism.
So could you explain what is albinism?
The term albinism refers to a set of inherited genetic conditions. The more colloquial term for a person with albinism would be albino. Albinism is characterized by the reduction or an absent or complete absence of pigment in the skin, hair, and/or eyes. The typical idea of an albino or a person with albinism is someone who has very white hair, very pale skin, and there's a misconception that we have pink or red eyes. That's not true. In addition to the reduction of pigment, which can run a range from very absolutely no pigment to a little pigment to even a little bit more pigment. One of the principal issues and the biggest challenges of albinism is the low vision associated with the condition. Because of the reduction or absence of pigment in the retina, people with albinism have an uncorrectable low vision that in many cases renders them legally blind. So people with albinism look different than their racial or ethnic heritage generally because of reduced or absent pigment, and they look different. They face the stigma of looking different, and they're in the disabilities community because we have an uncorrectable low vision and in many cases are considered legally blind.
I wanted to ask you about legally blind. I think people hear legally blind and they assume you can't see. And I have learned from you prior to this episode that that's not necessarily true. So could you define legally blind and explain how that differs from being completely blind?
The term legal blindness was established by the Social Security Administration as a way to determine if someone would get benefits for having for being legally blind. They set the threshold at an arbitrary place at 2,200. So anybody who has an eye exam where the optometrist or ophthalmologist says that their visual acuity is 2,200 or greater, they can be considered legally blind. Now, it gets a little complicated because there are different ways that optometrists and ophthalmologists measure vision. There are different charts. that are more or less precise. The other problem with setting this arbitrary measure is that a person who wears glasses, who has a refractive error, without their glasses, they could be measured at above, greater than 2200. And so without their glasses, they would be considered legally blind. So they add the terminology that best corrected to 2200 or less, you're legally blind. One of the other big misconceptions about blindness is that, and this applies to albinism as well, all blind people don't have the same conditions that impair their vision. And the range of what a blind person can see varies greatly. It could be that that person is profoundly blind and they don't see anything. Some people with blindness can distinguish between light and dark. Some people that are blind have a very narrow field of vision. There are dozens and dozens of conditions that lead to blindness, and there is a great range of what a person who's considered blind can or cannot see. There's another term that comes into play, which is functional vision. So you may have a person who has profound vision loss, but they have very good functional vision because they've been taught ways to cope with their low vision.
Now, you seem to have functional vision. Is that an accurate statement? I know that you're legally blind, but you are obviously functional.
The low vision associated with albinism, and I'm going to qualify this by saying absent any other eye condition. So a person with albinism is not exempt from having any other problem with their eyes. Typically, a person with albinism, because of the reduction or lack of pigment in their retina and because of a miswiring from the optic nerve to the brainstem. Now, let me just take a second and explain very briefly. I'm not a doctor and I don't play one on TV, but let me explain real briefly how a person sees. Light comes into your eyes and is focused on the fovea, the center part of your retina. In the retina, there are rods and cones that are connected to the optic nerve in the back of the eye. Those images, that information is taken in through your eye. Your eye is just the receptor. That information is transmitted from the retina, the back of your eye, through the optic nerve. And did you ever consider that you have two eyes, but you only see one image? So if you put a pair of binoculars up, you're seeing two images. What happens is that the wiring in your brain from the retina crosses over halfway to one side of your brain and halfway to the other side of your brain in the chiasm or the midbrain. And then that is transmitted to the brainstem where vision actually is functioned. So you may, there's sad documentation that many of our servicemen and women that are coming back from combat are being blinded, and largely part of that is due to the fact that they have head injuries that damage their brainstem and make them unable to see. So a person, to get back to what a person with albinism sees, a person with albinism has less depth perception because of that misrouting of the brain, of the optic nerve in the midbrain, and they are because of the problems with the lack of pigment in the retina, we don't see images sharply. So the way that we describe this is that a person with albinism sees the world through our parents' or our grandparents' old analog television versus a high definition television. So the impact on us is that we don't see detail. And with the lack of stereoscopic fusion, or the fact that our eyes are not working as well together, we have some depth perception issues. And finally, the lack of pigment in the back of the eye allows more light to come into the eye, and so people with albinism can be photophobic.
Okay, Well, that's certainly a thorough explanation. So great. So moving, what are some other forms? I mean, you talk about your organization, NOAA, also deals with other forms of hypopigmentation. So what other forms might that take?
Well, NOAA doesn't directly deal with other types of hypopigmentation. The hypopigmentation is in our name because hypopigmentation is the hallmark characteristic of a person with albinism. But there are other conditions that deal with an absence of pigment, like piebaldism or vitiligo, where patches of pigment you may see on the skin. The melanocytes don't work quite right, and a melanin pigment isn't formed. And you may see people that have parts of their hair that don't have color because of their condition.
Okay, so obviously, I mean, the disability portion comes from the legal blindness. So but there's an appearance issue as well. So what type of things do people with albinism and the piebald issue, like you mentioned, what type of things do they have to deal with?
I can illustrate that by telling a story about when I first went to school in kindergarten. My hair was as white that day when I was 5 years old as it is today when I'm 57 years old. And a 5-year-old with white hair is going to stand out. And I remember the eighth graders on the seventh and eighth graders, the older kids, decided that they would call me grandpa. What the impact is that unfortunately society judges a lot on appearance and stigmatizes anything that is different. So although I'm Northern Europe, my heritage is Northern European and more light-skinned than normal. The more light-skinned than most of the people on Earth. My hair was even light for that ethnicity. This is particularly troublesome for some people and for some people of color. So can you imagine an Asian person or a person with African heritage or Mediterranean heritage, where typically the people are more dark skinned, to have a child who is very blonde or even white haired? In extreme cases, say for a black family where a child with albinism is born, there can immediately be a question of where this baby came from, whether the mother had relations with a white man as opposed to with a black man. And that can lead to there's a whole range of problems that can happen as a result of a person being born with albinism.
So aside from questions like that about family and heritage and whatnot, I imagine that just being different, I mean, especially if you're a dark-skinned person who has a significant amount of pallor to them, would definitely, I mean, how do they fit in? I mean, how did you handle it when you were called grandpa? I mean, how was that for you, and what did you do?
I was, I think, blessed with a very supportive family and a positive outlook. I looked at it as being something, oh, well, look, the big kids are paying attention to me, so that's a good thing. But there are other points in your life where that's not as easy to deal with. When I was in middle and high school, and where you're in those crazy teenage years and you're trying to figure out who you are and how you fit into the world, being called an albino, just randomly on the street, or people asking you, hey, are you an albino? It's like, that would be like me asking you, hey, how much money do you make? It's kind of a personal question. There are times where you're not comfortable with dealing it. As a kid, there were a couple of times where I dealt with it badly. I remember specifically riding my bike one time when I was a kid, and a young girl passed me and said, "Hey, albino," and I used some inappropriate language back at her, and it really impacted her, strangely, that that she ended up being hurt because I had said something rude to her, but I don't think that she realized until then that she was saying something rude to me. I remember one time in my 40s, I was walking home from work, and it was on a spring or a summer day, so it's light out, the sun is shining. It's about 6 o'clock in the evening, and I'm in a business suit, and I'm carrying a laptop bag, and I walk by a bar, and I get about 100 feet past the bar, and I heard something that brought me way back to my youth, where some guy just yelled, "Hey, albino!" And I to this day don't understand why people do that, and I don't get it. I wouldn't I wouldn't say, "Hey, really tall guy," or "Hey, really fat guy." What I would never even dream of doing that. But for some reason, people seem like they are entitled to do that. And I remember being very, very, very angry when that happened. And I thought about turning around and going back and giving him what for. But then I thought for a second that, he's probably been sitting in that bar since about 3 o'clock. No good is going to come from that. So, people with albinism have to deal with the curiosity of other people. Another time I sat down on an L train in Chicago, and there was a young lady reading a book, and she glanced over at me and like all of a sudden slammed the book and went, "Oh, are you an albino?" And she was like she was genuinely very curious. And so, to be a wise guy, I pulled my wallet out and looked at my identification card and says, "Oh yeah, I am." And then we had a nice conversation. I explained to her a little bit about what it was like living with albinism. I'm not sure I answered your question.
Well, I sure did. And I mean, it really does help to have a sense of humor and also to have a good sense of yourself. And you actually talked about how it was kind of, well, personal, maybe not insulting, but personal to be called an albino. So that gets me into language. What is appropriate language, or is there appropriate language? I don't want to get into political correct. I want to get into what is respectful. I mean, aside from just keeping your mouth shut, which is probably appropriate most of the time. Well,
Well,
let's talk about language.
well, this is an interesting debate within the albinism community. There are people who consider the term albino to be the equivalent of a racial or an ethnic slur. And I think that comes from their own experiences where the word has been used in very hurtful ways.
Well, like with you.
Yeah, so, but that the balance to that is that the common language, or the common way that people, albino is scientifically correct. It is a description, but what it does is it puts the condition first and not the person. So in NOAA, we choose to use the term person with albinism. We choose to put the person ahead of the condition, but we don't say to those who are in the albinism community, "Thou shall use person with albinism and thou shall not use albino," because in order to communicate, even at the beginning of this interview, I chose to use the word albino to be explanatory to our audience, to bridge from the common term to the term that we prefer to use. Like much language, it depends upon the context. If
Intent.
someone is, very aggressively, putting you down and using the term albino and using it in a pejorative sense, it's obviously very hurtful and undesirable, but it can be benign. So there are a range of opinions within the albinism community, ranging from those who refer to themselves as albino to those who would never refer to themselves as an albino.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point to make, is it's more about intent. I mean, is that person, obviously a guy shouting at you from a bar, who knows why? Sometimes we just don't understand the motivations of other people. I mean, was there any point to that? Probably not. It didn't sound like he was necessarily trying to pick a fight. I mean, maybe he was proud of himself for recognizing, hey, that guy's different. He's pale. Maybe, I mean, maybe it was a real bonus that he even knew the word.
Well,
But,
or
but
more maybe he didn't have a very high self-esteem and he felt like, hey, I can pick on somebody else and get away with it. It could go either way.
well, and I also think that, I mean, we talked about intent, and I think one of the points that I discuss a lot is curiosity, and the fact that curiosity is a very human trait that's very normal. And for someone to ask you, are you an albino, may seem disrespectful, but on the other hand, I mean, people are always striving to learn and understand.
Mhm.
And like when you made a joke about it and then moved on, you guys had a wonderful, friendly conversation. And I think it's important not to, I mean, and I know I have to deal with it a lot with my appearance. Sometimes you just can't take it personally.
Yeah, that is, and being able to own it is very important. You know, if the person is curious, then it's easy to deal with them, and sometimes it's easy to make a joke. But sometimes people are cruel, and you have to figure out how to just move on. And think of it as being, if they have a problem with the way that you look, it's their problem. It's not yours.
And I think a lot of people don't really know what to say. And maybe, like I said, they're better off not saying anything, but
Right.
they just don't know what to say. And the assumptions that people make. I mean, we were like, I know that there's a few other assumptions, and maybe you mentioned this earlier, but I know you guys, you have issues because you tend to be very fair skinned. So, could you talk about some of the other things, the physical things that you have to deal with? And I remember we had a good laugh during our test about somebody said, "Hey, you're doing good for a blind person." So what are the things that people say to you that you just wish they wouldn't? And then
Um,
they're okay to say.
some of the things that are, kind of, there's a couple of things, very common things. One is like, hey, why don't you go out and get a tan? And it's like you obviously don't get it. I don't have any protection in my skin from the harmful rays of the sun. If I go out in the sun for 20 minutes without any protection, I'm going to be burned. There's no doubt about it. And one of the other ones is that, because we struggle to see things, oftentimes I'll be in public and I'll be looking at something really close, and someone will say, "Hey, why don't you get glasses?" And again, my wise guy remark is, "Are you an eye doctor? Do you know how to do that?" And I'll follow that up with, if you don't think that I thought of trying to go get glasses, if there was something that would correct my vision, I would be the first one to sign up for it. But the reality is that there's this uncorrectable low vision. There's also some other strange misconceptions and stereotypes about people with albinism that are out there that I have no idea where they come from. One is that people with albinism are less intelligent. I have no idea where that came from. And people will assume that, oh, well, if you have this thing wrong with you, then obviously you can't be very smart. Another one is this myth or misconception that people with albinism die young. I had an occasion where my mother was at home. She was, living alone. My father had passed away and everybody had moved out. And then a neighbor from years ago came calling to, just to say hello and catch up and whatnot. And I remember my mom describing the conversation and saying that this individual asked, "Well, how is Mike? Is he still alive?" And she said, "What would make you ask that?" Because I was, maybe in my 30s at the time. Well, oh, well, I heard albinos don't live long. the weird part about that is that there is a syndrome, Hermansky-Pudlak syndrome, which presents as albinism. So you have oculocutaneous albinism, or you have the reduced pigment in your skin, hair, and eyes. But there are some forms of Hermansky-Pudlak syndrome, or HPS, where there are other metabolical disorders, one of which is pulmonary fibrosis, which can, in some cases, in rare cases of people with albinism, that can lead to a premature death, because pulmonary fibrosis can develop in the 30s and 40s and lead to death. But it's such a small number. It boggles my mind that somehow in our culture throughout the ages, this idea that people with albinism don't live long got a foothold and lasted for hundreds and hundreds of years.
Well, and again, who knows where these things get started? I mean, actually, hundreds and hundreds of years ago, maybe that was true, because even though they have the same lifespan, I mean, look at it, could just be they might have been more vulnerable. Maybe they got skin cancers and stuff because they didn't have the same protection from the sun. I mean,
that's a good observation, Dawn, because in sub-Saharan Africa, that is a huge problem for people with albinism, because they don't have the protection from the sun. They don't have the sunscreen, and they're not, there's a lot of work going on now to try to remedy that. But if they were to, wear hats and long sleeves, they could protect their skin much more easily.
Well, and I know that this is not necessarily true of people, but I know, like, in the animal kingdom, if you're a deer and you're stark white and you're standing out in the forest, you might as well have a target painted on you.
Yeah.
Oh, and again, it doesn't quite equate to people, but there certainly would be some truth to that in the animal world. So I want to talk about Noah. How did you discover Noah, or did Noah discover you? And tell us about your role and what Noah does for people with albinism.
As you said at the beginning, well, I'll talk about my involvement first, how I got involved. Noah had a conference, a national conference in Chicago, where I live, in 1992. And it was covered in the newspapers. And a bunch of friends and family said, "Hey, look, there's a group for you." And I had never heard of Noah before that. And at the time, I was working on my master's thesis. So I clipped the article and set it aside. And about 6 or 8 or 9 months later, when I was done with the paper and it was accepted and I was going to graduate, I decided to turn my attentions to finding this organization called Noah. It took a little bit of digging to find it, because the newspaper article didn't have any contact information, and this was pre-internet days. So after a little digging, since I had been doing a lot of research, I knew some research librarians, and they found Noah for me. And it just so happened that I made contact with Noah, and they were having their first adult day in Chicago shortly after I contacted them. So I had the opportunity to enter the albinism community in a kind of an easy way with just 17 or 18 other adults with albinism, and it was kind of a few sessions on topics on the Americans with Disabilities Act and self-advocacy and coping mechanisms, but then a lot of it was social. So I decided that, well, this was kind of a cool thing to do. And the next year, my mother and wife and son traveled to the national conference in Philadelphia. And from then, I just got more and more and more involved. I ended up on the board in 1995, and I was chair of the board in 2001. And then, as you said in the opening, I ended up the executive director. It's what Noah is about, as you said in talking about our mission, is that we're a genetic support group. And what we do is we provide accurate and authoritative information about all aspects of albinism to those who are interested, primarily people with albinism and parents of kids with albinism. There is an intrinsic value for people who share a rare condition or disease to come together to share that experience, because they can't otherwise do so in society. You may have a family member that understands somewhat what you're going through because maybe they have that same condition or disease or whatever, and they may be able to empathize with you. But really being able to meet other people that have walked in your shoes is very empowering, and it is very, I think, good for the individual. So NOAA does any number of programs and services for people with albinism. Our big show is our biannual national conference that is going to be held in Pittsburgh next year in July. We expect somewhere around 900 to 1,000 people to be there. We run that conference like a business conference where there are informational sessions during the day. We run kids programs so that the parents and adults with albinism can attend those informational sessions and presentations and discussion groups without having to worry about who's taking care of the kids. We also do regional mini conferences. We've published 2 books for parents of children with albinism. One is a guide to the early years, and another is a guide to the school years. We run webinars, and we have parent connection opportunities where people with parents of kids with albinism can come together and discuss issues and hear presentations. We've published information bulletins about various aspects of living with albinism, and we publish a quarterly magazine that is all about living with albinism. One of the really neat things that we do to welcome people in the community is if a family who has a child with a recent diagnosis of albinism contacts us and are willing to talk to someone, we put them in contact with someone we call a rapid responder. Now, it's a trained person who is to respond to that person within 24 hours and answer any of their questions and share their experiences about being a parent of a child with albinism. And if the family is willing to continue to be contacted by us, we send what we call a welcome toolkit. And it's kind of like a baby gift. It has some sun protective clothing and a little hat and baby sunglasses and a year's membership and our book guide to the early years. We make a gift of that to the new members of the family. We also run a family camp in the off years. And as I mentioned, my first experience, we do an adult weekend, which actually was just this past weekend in Philadelphia.
So I was actually, one of the things that crossed my mind while you were talking about getting involved in NOAA, I know that when I was growing up, I did not have interaction with other people who looked different. I mean, my facial difference is somewhat of a unique situation. I don't have any particular syndrome that happened. I had a tumor that was removed. But I know that I really was not in contact with other people with facial differences. And of course, now that social media has come to being, I've been incredibly involved with other people with facial differences. So and it feels good, even though it didn't happen until I was in my 40s. So my question for you then is, how did it feel for you to be able to be with people who had albinism? I mean, have you been exposed to them when you were growing up at all?
That's a really, really good question. Like you, I didn't have any sustained interaction with anybody else with albinism until I wasn't into my 40s, but I was in my mid 30s. The only interaction that I had prior to that first adult weekend with NOAA was when I was in high school. There was a kid with albinism that was in a couple of my classes, and I went to an all-boys school, and he ended up moving away only about 2 or 3 months into our first year. And I knew him, and I actually sat next to him in a couple of classes because they made us sit up in front. But 14-year-old boys don't talk about their feelings. So there was never really not much of a connection there, and he was gone very quickly. The only other interaction was that I have a first cousin who has a daughter with albinism. And because of a family situation where a divorce took place between my uncle, this particular cousin and I were not connected until there was a death in the family where we came together at a funeral. And I very briefly met this she was young at the time, but we never connected. We never ever connected. So what's great about this question is how did I feel? When I first learned about Noah, as I described earlier, I had the opportunity to ease into the community by going to this event. It was in Chicago. It was someplace I could get to on public transportation by myself because, people with albinism are legally blind and most of them don't drive. But when I got the agenda for the meeting, it had the Americans with Disabilities Act. It had self-advocacy, and that made me frightened. It made me frightened that I would be with a bunch of people who felt sorry for themselves. The last thing I wanted to do was go to a pity party. And it took a lot. It took a lot to go to this. I can't remember many times in my life where I was as nervous as I was. I'm not typically a nervous person, but I was nervous going to this. I even had an exit strategy. I had a pager at the time for work, and I told my wife that if things were going bad, I was going to have her page me, and I was going to feign this, an emergency at work, gotta go, And,
date unintended.
And so when I got there, the way I describe it is I've never experienced this. I've never flown past the speed of sound, but they say that when a plane approaches the speed of sound, there's a vigorous buffeting that you go through. And then after that, things are smooth. The flight is just amazing. So I felt that going into the community because of that trepidation and that fear. But when I got there, it was as if you had randomly picked 18 people off the streets of the United States and you threw them in a room together. The only thing that they had in common was that they had albinism. There was the bubbly little 20-something girl who was running the thing, and there was the bookish University of Chicago graduate student in German, and there was the young party boy dude, and all this. They were just people. But the one thing we had in common was albinism. And one of the things that was unusual about that is that the conference had been in Chicago the year before, so many of them had been had to the conference, and they had taken pictures. Now, this was back when you actually printed a picture, and so people had their albums and their stacks of pictures, and they're handing around, and everybody's looking at it, up close. And I'm looking at that and saying, "Damn, is that the way I look?" No wonder people have been saying that this looks weird to me for so many years. So, the part of the story is that even though I had that exit strategy, I kept calling my wife saying, "It's going good, it's going good." I ended up staying with the group until about 1 the next morning because we went out to dinner, and we might have consumed a few adult beverages, and I had a really great time. On the way out of the albinism community, I felt a buffeting again because when I left, I went back to the normal world, the real world, where I was the one guy, and I wasn't with people that shared my experience. So the first several times that I went into an outside and then left the albinism community, I felt that it's very, very tangible. I'm very grateful for the experience of being able to be involved with Noah because I feel it filled a corner of my life that was missing, that was empty, that not knowing that there were other people and not knowing them that had gone through the same thing that I had left me wondering, why me? Why am I the only one?
Well, one of the things that I've done by doing these webinars is, yes, I've connected with my facial difference community, but I have discovered that pretty much anyone with a physical difference, we can share stories. I mean, people may not say the same things to me that they do to you, or make the same assumptions. I mean, my face is different, therefore I must be mentally incapacitated.
Yep.
But it's a shared experience. And, one of my goals is to try to educate people that are outside of having a physical difference to understand that, our difference is on the outside, but everybody has a difference. So, Mike, I'm going to ask you another hard question, or maybe it's easy, since you deal with people through Noah all the time. If you had a piece of advice, somebody emailed you or somebody called you on the phone and said, hey, I'm kind of having a hard time dealing with the fact that I have albinism. I just don't feel like I can blend into social circles, or maybe they have other insecurities related to how they look. What would you say to them? What advice? What is the number one thing that you would say to them to try to help get them on the right track to being a happier person?
That is a tough question. I recognize that I was blessed with a very supportive family. I never felt from my family members that I felt different. So there are a couple of things that I would advise or would hope that people who look different would try to do. Is, first of all, associate yourself with people who don't judge you that way, or don't think, well, you're okay for a person with a facial difference. That you don't need that person. You need the person who says you're okay because you're okay. And I choose to be your friend, and I choose to respect you and regard you because of who you are, not because of what you look like. Another part of it is that I've talked about it before, that you can't let society dictate to you what's normal and what's beautiful and what's correct. One of the interesting things is that some of the advice that I've heard people with albinism give, there's one woman who said that, her mother told her, if when you go out in public, people are going to look at you, give them something to look at. So go out there, look your best, act with confidence, and realize that that person who looks at you and instantly judges you because of your appearance and instantly judges you incorrectly, that's their problem. It's not your problem. No individual, as you said, Dawn, our differences are on the outside. There's lots and lots of differences on the inside that people don't see. And I think that, unfortunately, our society uses appearance. I know lots of people where they have a great outward appearance, but their lives are pretty messed up underneath. Stick with people who really care about you. Own your physical difference. Don't let other people own it, and carry yourself with confidence.
And I am guessing that there are quite a few people with albinism who are quite attractive.
Well, I'm biased on that. I think that there are some stunningly gorgeous. When I go to a conference, little boys with albinism are always the best looking. They just, because they remind me of me. No, I'm kidding. My tongue is in my cheek.
Probably not. What do I know?
No.
You should have given me a picture of when you were a boy. That would have been fun. But anyway, I mean, just seriously, we got, got white hair and the ice blue eyes, or whatever blue eyes you have. I mean, come on, there's got to be people that are going to find that pretty cool.
Well, there was a story about when I was young. My father was a blue collar guy, and he, his idea of going out would be like a diner or a truck stop or something like that. And I remember being in a diner when I was about, 6 or 7 years old, and some, buxom bleach blonde server waitress, I guess they were waitresses then, grabbed me by my hair and said, "I pay $50 to get hair like this. This kid gets it for free." And so I think that there are some desires that some people want to achieve the look, but I think the reality is that most people, it's only recently that models with albinism are even being used by magazines or advertisers. For the most part, we don't fit the conventional definition of beauty, but I have to agree with you, Dawn. There are some stunningly good-looking people with albinism.
They call it platinum blonde.
Platinum blonde, right?
That's seriously, like she said, some people pay a lot of money for it. But anyway, Mike, first of all, anybody has any questions that they haven't asked, please type them in. We're getting ready to wrap up, and I just want to say to Mike, thank you so much for coming on with me. It's been really educational, and I actually get the pleasure of meeting Mike because I'm going to be traveling to Chicago in the not too distant future. So not only do I get to meet people online on my webinars, but sometimes I get to actually meet them in person. And I just think it's a privilege to be able to do that.
I do agree with that, Dawn. And one of the things that you said earlier really rings true with me. I have found that the connection between the disabilities community and people who look different is really universal. We deal with many of the same issues.
Yeah, and I mean, I make assumptions about other people with differences, and I try not to because I try to be more educated. But the reality is, and that's one of the reasons I do this show, we all share that. And most importantly, what we share is the fact that we're human, that we're people, and we have these feelings. And I think the more we admit that we have these feelings and own these feelings, the better off we're all going to be. Whether you have a physical difference or your difference is inside. And believe me, some of us with physical differences have a lot going on inside too, which may or may not be related. But anyway, Mike, again, thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and wrap the show unless you have any closing comments. Do you have any closing comments, Mike?
Again, thank you very much for the opportunity to get the word out there about albinism. It's part of our mission to do that, and I hope that this session has been informative and worth the time of the people who've decided to tune in.
Well, yeah, and again, I mean, one of the beauties of this is that it is saved onto YouTube and it becomes available for people to watch, whether you're watching it live or watching it later. I think it's just a tremendous educational resource.
Yeah. Thank you again for the opportunity.
Just a pleasure to have you. I just love making these connections. It's so awesome. So I wanted to say, my next webinar is going to be on Tuesday, September 29th at noon Pacific, 3 p.m. Eastern with Roland. I'm going to butcher this, Roland, and I apologize. Roland Bienvenu, who he has Mobius syndrome, and he's with the Mobius Syndrome Foundation. I actually found out not too long ago that September is craniofacial month, whatever that means. So Roland was kind enough to come on and talk about the facial paralysis that comes with Mobius syndrome. And always remember, you want to make sure that you are kind to others. Like it's not just about intent. Just make sure that what you choose to say is kind. And don't forget, at the same time, be kind to yourself, because that's important too. And I will, as soon as I can figure out. I love tech. It's so much fun. There we go. And
we are love, we are one, we are how we treat each other when the day is done. We are peace. We are war. We are how we treat each other, nothing more. We are how we treat each other, nothing more. We are how we treat each other.